For me, it's really hard to tease apart what's ADHD and what's anxiety because it's all just me mixed together. A couple weeks ago, I made a video about anxiety. Sometimes it's weird for me. It's always weird for me. It is weird for me to talk about anxiety because when I read about anxiety or watch videos about anxiety, I have a diagnosis of anxiety. If you're new here, I have a smorgasbord of diagnoses: autism, ADHD, anxiety. But when I read about anxiety, it's probably the one that I don't really question, I guess. But maybe I have the hardest time relating to it because the things that I think of as anxiety are, when I go and I read a description of ADHD, it's like, oh, that's ADHD. Everything that I think of as anxiety fits under ADHD, which I know that it's like 50% of people who have ADHD have anxiety, according to the MedMD article that I just read. I think for me, it's almost hard to tease apart the two, but also because when I read articles about anxiety, they talk so much about feelings. Anxiety has never been something really that I've felt. I have had 2 panic attacks in my entire life. That's pretty much close to the extent of feeling anxiety for me, with one exception, and that's right before I get really sick, like pneumonia level sick or like hospitalized level sick. I'll start to feel really anxious, like super depressed, super anxious. That has happened like maybe 4 times in my life. So now, anytime I start to get that feeling, that super anxious feeling, like the whole entire world is about to fall apart, I know that something horrible is about to happen to my body. The next day I'm probably gonna feel like I've been hit by a truck. It's bad. When I read descriptions of anxiety on like checklists, if you Google symptoms of anxiety, I don't find myself relating to those very much at all, which is a little bit strange because when I read a checklist for autism or ADHD, I'm like, hey, look, that's me right there. That's me. But I also don't really doubt that I have it. I think that sometimes anxiety might be a little bit different for people who are autistic and people who have ADHD, that we might experience it a little bit differently, especially in a world where psychologically things are talked about a lot in terms of emotions. And I do have a lot of emotions, feel a lot of emotions. Apparently anxiety is just one that, I don't know, that I don't think I process quite normally. I think in an ADHD sort of way, and also in a diagnosed 20 years ago PTSD sort of way, I stay busy, super busy. In another video where I talked about anxiety, someone inadvertently suggested that anxiety has to do with not knowing what we're capable of. And I think that's not exactly true, especially for a lot of people, I think, who are neurodivergent. This is something particularly that I've learned about people with ADHD, and I'm going to share my own experience here as someone with ADHD. And I know my experience is very similar to Paul's, and I know I've read a lot of different things by other people with ADHD who've actually had the same experience. And this is one of the reasons I wanted to talk about this today, because I think a lot of the times when people talk about anxiety, they think about being really nervous and fearful. And with my personal experience, that hasn't overwhelmingly been the case. My personal experience with ADHD has been, and for me, it's really hard to tease apart what's ADHD and what's anxiety because it's all just me mixed together. But I thought about this a lot at the start of the pandemic, looking back over different parts of my life, the things that are harder for me and the things that are easier. A lot of times I know that it probably seems like the things that are harder for me to get done are silly, answering emails or Messenger or replying to comments, because they're just not that big a deal. I should just sit down and do them. Basic social interactions, and they're not even face to face. It shouldn't really be that hard, and that's what I tell myself too. Except for that lately I've been a lot easier on myself. Probably one of my biggest problems is, and has always been, especially since moving out at college, is procrastination. It's that I can just put it off a little bit longer and a little bit longer and a little bit longer, and I just keep doing that until then I'm embarrassed. I got this message on my phone, and I'm sure you've seen memes like this. At least they're all over the ADHD pages. I get a message and I look at it and I promise that I'm going to respond. I'm just a little bit too busy right this second. I'll do it later. And then it's the next day, and obviously it's too late, but I will get to it. And then it's 12 weeks later, and now I obviously can't respond, and it's in this graveyard of shame with all of the other texts and messages that I haven't responded to. Now I can't text that person at all. And that's how a lot of things work for me. I just wait a little bit too long, and then it's embarrassing to respond. It's something I'm even excited to respond to, and then the time passes and it's embarrassing. That isn't always the case, but it's happened a lot of time. Procrastination, though, is a big thing because I just put things off that are things that are just a little bit hard until they become a little bit harder, until they become embarrassing, and then it's way harder than it should have been if I just done it right away. Then it becomes weird or embarrassing or impossible almost, and that's the story. But the thing is, what I think people don't realize is, for a lot of us with ADHD, I don't know how many, I'm not about to claim all of us, obviously, but for at least some of us, you can chime in here if you fall under this category. I know Paul does. I know other people do because I've heard them talk about it too. A lot of us are good in emergency situations. I'll bring up something that happened since I had this vlog, and I didn't talk about it on the vlog at the time when it happened, because at the time I was probably still trying to catch my breath, but it was right when I started this channel a couple years ago, and I was driving home from some sort of appointment that I had had in the city near us. Every time I took this turn in my car, I thought about how scary it was to cross the street there. Because when we lived in the city, we walked a lot, and it was a street that I remembered having a terrible time crossing. I remember one time I crossed it pushing a stroller with the kids in it and almost getting hit by several cars that had turned left on red because it's a one-way street, so they could turn left against the red light. And even though I had the sign, I had the walk sign, no one was stopping for me and almost getting hit there. So the light turned green. I was able to go. I seen there was a pedestrian there who was going the same direction as us, so I stopped for him and he stepped out in front of me. He hadn't looked or anything, but I saw him, so I stopped for him. But there was a huge truck next to me who barreled right through and hit him and threw him a good distance. When I'd stopped for him, I was thinking, don't get hit, don't get hit, don't get hit, don't get hit, because he was gonna walk no matter what, which he had the light to walk, but I just had remembered how many people had almost hit me there, and all the times that I thought, like, this is the perfect place for someone to get hit. And so I pulled through, and there was a car dealership over on the side, and I pulled out into the car dealership and jumped out of my car and ran over. I was a lifeguard for 8 years, so I've gone through, just Red Cross training over and over and over again. Because even when I wasn't going through the training myself, I had always gone, when I was like pool supervisor and head lifeguard and stuff, I would go and for the new trainees and assist with the class, assist with them going through the class, at least for like 5 years of it when I was head lifeguard and stuff before I went to college. So I ran over there. A bunch of other cars had stopped to block the way, and he was laying in the street, but no one had touched him. He was just laying there, and people had their cell phones out and were on their cell phones, and I'd called from the car. I called and said the cross streets, and they asked if I was going to try to help, and the operator asked if I was going to try to help, and I said yes, and they said okay and let me get off the phone instead of keeping me on the phone. And so I ran over there. The man that had been hit was an older man. He was unconscious on the ground, and no one was helping him at that point. I got down on the ground, and some people yelled at me not to touch him, and all I could think was that if it was my husband or dad or son, that I wouldn't want him to be down there on the ground by himself. And so I got down on the ground and I did what they taught us of put my arms on either side of his head and started supporting his head, and blood started to come out of he was hurt. The police got there. I probably ended up supporting his head for about 10 minutes Well, they got a stretcher there and were trying to get him on, and he regained consciousness, and they were trying to keep his spine in alignment because he was really out of it and couldn't breathe. They kept just telling me to hold on to his head and try to keep his neck straight. So in situations like that, I tend to stay really, really calm, remember what to do. The same thing when I was like 16 and I'd gone through lifeguard training a couple times, because I started lifeguarding when I was 15. We came upon a car wreck where the lady had a very obvious broken arm, and we were the first ones there. My dad was driving, and he'd been teaching EMT classes that I'd been in the room for since I was like a little kid. I would go and be the dummy. He was like, hey, time to practice what you learned, and had me get out of the car and help stabilize her arm while he stabilized her head until the paramedics got there. And in situations like that, I'm good. In scary situations, I don't pause or freeze up. And the thing is, that's probably part of my anxiety, I guess. My brain is always going through what ifs and emergency situations, and is always busy thanks to ADHD. I guess that is part of anxiety. Those situations don't cause me to freak out. But replying to emails, there was one time when I was a lifeguard, when I was 15, when someone fractured their skull and I froze. There were other people, like 6 other people that were close, that all had it handled, but I froze, and I spent years going over that in my head over and over again until I absolutely knew everything that I could have done right instead of what I did, which was freeze and not do anything, even though it was probably not totally a bad thing that I froze, because it was like a group home fight and a bunch of boys, and I was like the only girl there that was lifeguarding that day, so probably not totally bad that I froze in that particular situation, but still. Anyways, ADHD and anxiety. I guess that's the anxiety part. Fretting over little things that aren't supposed to make me anxious. Well, not being anxious in those big situations that probably should be more anxiety inducing. Honestly, the things that I would say caused anxiety to ultimately catch up with me in the last couple of years were things like when Tessie was little. Her apnea, her not being able to breathe at night, I would say was a totally valid reason to start being super anxious. And we're through that. It's over. The threat of the insurance company that was constantly going back and forth over whether they would pay for a monitor or not, whether they were taking it away month to month, whether we would know if she stopped breathing. There were some pretty scary times there for a while, and it was super stressful. It was just such a stressful time, and there were so many appointments, and it was not good. Anyways, I guess that's what I needed to get out of my system on this whole thing about ADHD and anxiety that I am not claiming to be an expert about. I know that I don't fully understand it. I've read about it, I've been watching videos about it, and I feel like I really don't get it. That maybe there's other people out there that don't get it with me. But yeah, that's how it works for me. I guess for me, anxiety is the little things that get to me ultimately. It's not the big things. Those are the things that I know that I have to do. Even things that I don't have to do right away, ultimately I do because I know that I need to do them. Anyways, that is it for today. If you like this video, I'd love it if you give it a thumbs up. And if you're interested in all things autism, I'd love it if you did subscribe, and I'll see you tomorrow. Bye.